Hello everyone, I'm Carolina and welcome back to another sewing tutorial. Today we are making the all-weather jacket. I'm wearing it right now and you can get the pattern for this style on my website, studiocarolinashear.com. I'm gonna link it down below as per usual. If you want to see the making of this jacket, like the thought process behind the pattern and prototypes and all the different steps, you can check out the vlog. I'll link it here for you. And if you saw this piece and post a picture on Instagram, please tag me at studiocarolinashear and use the hashtag #CSAllWeatherJacket so that I can see what you make. And that's all I had to say, so let's get started. All information regarding what pieces you need to cut in which fabric and how many of each piece is in the pattern file on pages 6, 7, and 8. It's called Pattern Consumption and Pattern Layout, plus Pattern Pieces Overview. And if you have any questions at all during the process of making your all-weather jacket, do not hesitate to send me a message. I'm always here to help. For your main fabric, I suggest using a medium to heavyweight non-stretchy fabric. For this jacket, I'm using a wool canvas that's quite fluid and medium weight. For the jacket I'm wearing, I used a heavyweight tweed, so it's fluid, but it's heavier, so it gives more structure. But you could use a denim, a corduroy, gabardine. The possibilities are endless. For my lining fabric, I'm using two different fabrics for this jacket. I would have used the tartan for the entire lining, but I didn't have enough. And I also feel like doing the zipped chest pocket in two different fabrics is going to be a little bit more pedagogic. Both of them are viscose, they're quite lightweight, but the tartan is definitely heavier weight than the black fabric. For this jacket, I've actually used a heavyweight fabric for my sleeves because I wanted them to be more structured and puffy and give a lot of warmth. So you could use a heavyweight fabric, but just know that if you use a really thick fabric for your lining, it's going to get bulky because it's an oversized style, it's a large body jacket. So if you use a really heavy, thick fabric, the jacket will appear bigger. So I'm just gonna quickly go through the different pieces of the pattern. This pattern comes with a lining. So I have two lining fronts, one left, one right. And on one of the lining fronts, I have marks for a zipped slit pocket. You choose whichever front you want this to be on. Mine is on the left side because I am right-handed, so it's just easier for me to open it that way. And the pieces that go with the zipped slit pocket are your pocket facing. You have a piece of interfacing that will go behind the facing. Then you have your zipped slit pocket. That's so difficult saying. Then you have your zipped slit pocket bag A and your zipped slit pocket bag B. So here I'm doing the pocket sacks A and B in a different lining fabric to better illustrate the reason behind the facing and why I'm not doing it in just two pieces, like two pocket sack pieces. Then I have one back lining cut on fold. I have two back lining sleeves and I have two front lining sleeves because the sleeves in this jacket is a two-piece sleeve. These are my upper front main fabric pieces, my lower front main fabric pieces, my front pocket sack pieces, my upper back main fabric piece cut on fold, my lower back main fabric piece also cut on fold, and again my two-piece sleeves, the two back sleeves and two front sleeves cut in main fabric. For my belt pieces, I have two belt pieces and then the two belt loops cut in one long piece. You can interface your belt if you want to, both pieces or one piece or neither. It depends completely on your fabric, the look you're going for, and your preference. I will interface one of my belt pieces in this fabric. So for my edges, I'm using a brown bias binding. I have a zipper for my lining chest pocket, not an invisible zipper, just a regular zipper. I have a bunch of different threads because I'm using different colors on all of my fabrics. I also have a brown top stitching thread to match my bias binding because I'm going to be doing some nice top stitching on this one. And depending on what closure you want, you can use buttons, regular buttons, or you could use snap buttons. On the jacket that I'm going to be doing today, I will not add buttons, but as you can see, I have buttons on this one. So that's totally up to you. So for all of the supplies, check page 1 of the pattern file and you'll have all the measurements and the supplies listed. So I'm going to start with sewing my zipped slit pocket. I'll start with making my marks on my lining piece. Then I'll take my facing piece and make the marks on the facing as well, following the marks on the pattern. Take your interfacing piece and iron it on the wrong side of your lining fabric, right underneath the marks. This is to stabilize the pocket opening, the corners, the zipper, just give it a little bit of extra support. Then I'll take my pocket facing and place that on top of the markings of my front lining piece, right sides facing each other, aligning the markings and pinning that in place. Then I'll just draw a line between my 4 markings, making it a long rectangle, and then I'll stitch in these lines. So this is what your rectangle should look like. Now I'll just go in and mark the middle of this rectangle and 1 centimeter from each side. So you're going to have this line in the middle and then 2 triangles on each end. And I'll cut the rectangle open along the middle and then cut diagonally into every corner to get the corners nice and sharp. All right, we got an opening. Now I'll just remove my pins and I will flip this inside out. I'll flip the facing to the inside of the lining. To get the seam around the opening really nice and flat, you can iron the seam allowance open like I'm doing here. Then flip the facing through the opening and iron it flat on both inside and outside. Okay, so this is what we have, a nice looking opening there. Now I'll take my zipper and I'll pin it in place on the inside, placing it so the zipper teeth are nicely in the middle of the opening. And I have my zipper cursor right where I want it to be, pin that in place. And then I'll do a top stitch really close to that edge, like 2 millimeters from the edge. And I'll switch to my zipper foot when I do this because it's really gonna allow me to get close to that edge and give me a nicer finish. All right, there we go. Honestly, I think that looks pretty good, pretty neat, very satisfying. Now I'll take pocket sacks A and B. Pocket sack A is smaller than pocket sack B. And that is because pocket sack A connects to the facing and pocket sack B goes from top of facing to bottom of pocket sack A. So here I'm just showing you how these pieces fit together. So you have the pocket sack A that's pinned to the lower part of the facing, pocket sack B that goes on top of all of that. So I'll start with the smaller pocket sack, the pocket sack A, and I'll pin that to the bottom of my facing. Right sides facing each other. So I'll sew that together with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I will iron that seam allowance open and then down to the pocket sack A. And then I will also overlock that edge to really reinforce it, make it secure so that when you put your stuff in your pocket, that seam doesn't crack. Also, I say overlock, but you can totally zigzag this. Like, you do not have to overlock. You can, if you don't have an overlocker, do not worry. Everything that I say to overlock, you can equally do with a zigzag stitch on your domestic machine. Now I'll take my pocket sack B and I will place that on top of all of that and I'll pin it around all edges. So pocket sack B is the size of your facing and pocket sack A together. And I'll sew this the exact same way. I'll sew it with a straight stitch around all edges and then I will overlock the seam allowance together. So when you overlock, you should always leave a little thread tail, and that's just so that the seam doesn't unravel with time. And then you will take your thread tail. If you're not closing that overlocked edge in any other way, you need to sew that thread tail into your overlocked seam to secure it in place, just so it doesn't come undone with time. So I'm using a big needle to do this. It's really quick. It doesn't have to look great because this is on the inside of your jacket, like between your main fabric and your lining. Nobody's gonna see it. Just secure your overlocked edges and then cut the excess off. Okay, this is a really bright sunny day when I'm sewing this, so I apologize for that, but also like enjoy the sunshine, you know? Okay, so we're done. The lining pocket is done. This is what it looks like. So now you can see why I use a facing. If I would have sewn that facing in the black fabric that I used for the second lining of my pocket, that black fabric would have been visible in the fold of the opening on the outside. It would have looked not neat. It would have looked a little, just not very clean work. So if you're doing a zipped pocket like this, you should always have your facing in the same fabric as your outer layer of the piece that you're putting the pocket on. Unless you're doing like, you know, something a little artistic where you have the fabric showing. But like for a neat finish, this is what you do. Now I'll continue with my main fabric jacket. So I'll take my lower front pieces and I'll attach the front pocket sacks to these pieces. I'll attach the pocket sacks to the pocket placement with a 1 centimeter seam allowance and a straight stitch. If you're wondering why the pocket placement is higher up than the rest of the piece, check out my vlog on this jacket because I'm explaining that in detail there. So this is what that looks like. Now I'll just overlock that edge to reinforce the connection because this is a pocket again and you're going to be putting your hands in and out. Then I will iron that seam allowance towards the pocket sack. I'll do an understitch along that connecting seam on the pocket sack side. And that's what that looks like. Now I'll take my lower front with the attached pocket sacks and attach them to the upper front. And the upper front has a pocket sack integrated. So you just match that up with the pocket sack that you just sewed on to the lower front. And to know which side is the front and which side is the side of your lower front, you have a curve on the bottom of the center front on the lower front piece. So that's how you know that that side is the center front and matches up with the front of your upper front piece. Just pin that together all around. This is what it's gonna look like. You're gonna have your pocket opening in that connecting seam. Now you want to sew that together with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance like everywhere else. And we're also at the same time going to sew the lower back together with the upper back. So it's the same thing, you pin those together and the lower back is just a rectangle. And you have a notch near the upper edge of the lower back. That's how you know that that's the top edge of the lower back. And that edge is the one that goes with the upper back. You also want to match up your center notches. You have a center notch on the upper back that matches with the center notch on your lower back. So pin that together in place. And sew with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now I'm also going to overlock or zigzag all of this seam allowance on the back and the front. Again, this is just to reinforce that seam because you're going to be taking your hands in and out of the pocket, so the seam needs to be strong. Then in the back, I suppose you don't have to overlock or zigzag it together, but it just gives a little security, you know? Now iron all of that seam allowance downwards into the lower pieces. Give it a good iron, flat out that seam. And here you have your pocket. It's kind of like hidden, and I think it's a really nice touch with the tartan fabric in there. I love tartan. Moving right along, I'll be sewing my outer seams on my sleeves. So first I'll identify my back sleeves on my front sleeves. Check your pattern pieces and match up one back sleeve with one front sleeve. Make sure they have one right sleeve and one left sleeve. You also have 2 notches on that center edge of your outer seam. So match those up and then pin your curved seams together. I find it really helpful to pin both of my sleeves together at the same time, so I know for a fact that I'm making one left sleeve and one right sleeve. The amount of times that I have sewn 2 right sleeves or 2 left sleeves is embarrassing, and therefore I prefer to pin both of my sleeves at the same time so I am not making any mistakes. I will also pin my lining sleeves at the same time and sew them at the same time to, again, just make sure that I'm making no duplicate sleeves. I'm making the exact number of sleeves that I need. Now I'll sew those curved outer sleeve seams together, 1 centimeter seam allowance, a straight stitch, and then I'll iron that seam allowance open on both my lining sleeves and my main fabric sleeves. If you do not get in there with the iron on the seam, it's gonna get kind of bubbly. So really work it with the iron until it is nice and flat. Now I'll attach my main fabric sleeves to my main fabric body. I'll start with my back piece. So I have notches on my body pieces on the raglan seam and on my sleeve pieces on the raglan seam. Match these notches up between body and sleeve and pin edge to edge. I'm going to also pin the front body to the front sleeve. And the same thing here, I have notches on the body, I have notches on the sleeves, match them up. And then I am going to sew all of those seams with a straight stitch, 1 centimeter seam allowance. But before I sew that, I'm also going to pin my lining body to my lining sleeves, and then I'm just gonna sew all of that in one go. When all of my raglan seams are sewn, I'm going to iron that seam allowance open and then into my sleeves. Later on, I will top stitch these seams, so I'm just prepping for that, and then I'll switch my thread out. Now I'll move on to my belt. So I have 2 belt pieces, and I have decided to interface one of these pieces. You do whatever you want to do based on your fabric. Either interface none of them, interface both, interface one. It is up to you. But if you decide to interface, you want to do that now. When that's done, I will pin my belt pieces together, right sides facing each other. And when I sew the belt pieces together, I will leave an opening so that I can flip the belt right sides out. I suggest leaving the opening kind of on the side of the belt so it falls right under a belt loop. Ideally, this opening is not going to be visible when the belt is done, but in case it is, in case there's a little bump there, I don't know, then it's good if it's on the side because it's going to be hidden by your arms, it's going to be hidden by the belt loop. Like, you do not want that on your center back because that's going to then be very visible. I would also suggest having it on the bottom edge of your belt for that same reason. All right, now I will sew those pieces together with 1 centimeter seam allowance, straight stitch. And this is what it looks like when it's done. I have my opening there. Before I flip the belt right sides out, I'll cut my corners. This is to facilitate the pointy corner, because if you have a lot of fabric bunching up in the corners, they're not going to be pointy. They're going to be rounded, they're going to be bulky and thick. So cut off as much seam allowance as possible in your corners. Obviously don't cut too close to the seam because then it's going to unravel. Then we're gonna commence with the tedious task of flipping the belt right sides out. It's a lot of pulling, a lot of pushing. And if you've been hanging out here for a while, you know that I am a big fan of the chopstick method, where I just take a chopstick and I shove it up the corners to get them pointy. When that is flipped right sides out, I will iron it flat and I'll kind of roll the edges a little bit so that I iron on the seam and not a bunch of excess fabric kind of enclosing around the seam. And in my opening, I will just iron the seam allowance into the opening. I'll just let it naturally fall into the fold. Now I'll make my belt loops. So I'll take my belt loop piece and I'll overlock one of the longer edges. Then I will fold it in 2 or 3. Then I'll fold it in 2. Yeah, because I'll fold it twice, but there's going to be 3 layers. So the belt loop is 3 centimeters wide. So I'll fold the edge that is not overlocked 1 centimeter in. Then I'll fold the other edge that is overlocked 1 centimeter in, enclosing that raw edge underneath the overlocked edge. And this is what it should look like when it's done. So you have a belt loop that is 1 centimeter wide in 3 layers. Now I'll do my top stitching on my main fabric pieces. So I'll take my top stitching thread, which is thicker than a normal thread, and I'll top stitch on both sides of my curved center sleeve seam. I'll also top stitch along my raglan seam on the sleeve side. And that is where I have my seam allowance ironed to. So I will just lock that seam allowance into my sleeve with my top stitch. And if you want, you could also top stitch on the body side of your raglan seam. Like, the top stitching is, you know, an artistic decision. It's like your creative juices flow. Choose wherever you want your top stitch. This is what I'm doing, but you do whatever you want to do. That is what that top stitch looks like on the curved sleeve seam. I think that's really nice. I really like it. On this one, I don't really have visible top stitching, but I really like how that looks. I think that's very nice finish. Moving on to the belt, I'll do 2 rows of top stitching next to each other. And this is also how I will close that opening in the belt. I'll just top stitch over it. I'm not gonna do any like hand stitching to close it because you don't really need to. You just top stitch over the seam allowance and that's gonna lock that opening closed. And that's what it looks like with the 1 top stitched seam. God, that's so difficult to say. And that's what it looks like with the 1 top stitch seam. If you only want to do 1, you can do 1. I'm doing 2. And this is what it looks like with the two seams. Now I'll also do top stitching on my belt loop. This is to lock the folds in place. So I'll do one line of top stitching on each side. On the jacket, you don't really need to do top stitching. It's like a creative decision that you can take. But on the belt and the belt loop, you're going to need to have some top stitching. First of all, to keep the belt and belt loop flat, but also to close the opening on the belt and lock the fold on the belt loop. And this is what the top stitching looks like on the belt loop piece. I'm also going to do a top stitch along the raglan seam on my lining jacket. This is optional. You don't need to do this. I chose to do this because I like how it looks. I also like to lock my seam allowance in place, but it doesn't really fill a function. Like, you don't have to do this. That's why I also didn't include it in the written instruction of the pattern. Anyway, that's what it looks like. I think that's really nice. Now I'll close my side seams, and I'll close my side seam on the sleeve and the body in one go. So from the bottom of my body pieces to the opening, like to the end of my sleeve. When I do this, I'll make sure to match up my armhole seam on my front and my back. And I'm matching up those two seams by putting a needle through the seam on both the front and the back. And that way I know the seams are fully aligned. And I'll just pin along that entire edge. And there's notches along these edges to match up your pieces. So I'll do that on my lining jacket and my main fabric jacket. On my main fabric, I'm also paying attention to aligning the seams connecting my lower pieces with my upper pieces of the front and back. On the main fabric, I have more notches than on my lining fabric because I have 2 notches for my belt loop positions as well. So there's 3 notches really close to each other on the main fabric side seam. You have the 2 belt loop notches, and then between those 2, you have your waist notch. And I suggest doing a little mark where these belt loop notches are. So when you sew the side seam shut, you still have the position of the belt loops on the outside. The waist notch you do not need to mark. Only mark your 2 belt loop notches. So I'll do the exact same thing on the other side seam. And then I'll sew my side seams together on both my lining jacket and on my main fabric jacket with a straight stitch and 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I will iron the seam allowance open. And now I've also chosen to top stitch the connecting seam between the lower and the upper body on my main fabric jacket. I've decided to top stitch above the connecting seam, but you could top stitch under the connecting seam. You could top stitch both above and below the connecting seam. Again, this is your jacket. You do whatever you want, but I'm going to top stitch above that connecting seam. If you top stitch below the connecting seam, make sure that you do not top stitch your pocket shut. So lift your pocket up and top stitch underneath that if you decide to top stitch below. So I'm just gonna change my thread again to my top stitching thread and get going. I've pinned my pockets shut when I do this to make that line straight so I can follow that connecting seam, because if my pockets were open, I would just be like, whoa, sewing all over the place. So pinning it shut just gives me a bit more guidance. And this is what the top stitching looks like when it's done. Now I'll stabilize my belt loop positions with a little piece of interfacing on my side seam allowance on my main jacket. So I'll just iron this interfacing on the inside between my belt loop notches on both side seams. Then I'm going to take my belt loop piece that are my 2 belt loops together, and each belt loop has 1 centimeter seam allowance on each end. So I will fold my belt loop piece in half and cut it. And then I will end up with 2 belt loops. So I'm just going to fold in my 1 centimeter seam allowance on each end of the belt loops. There you go, that's what it should look like. And you have 2 ways of sewing on your belt loops. So it depends on your fabric. There's the standard way where you just kind of fold in the ends and then you do a bar tack on top of each end. This is what we see on most of our jeans, for example. But sometimes that can be really hard work for a domestic machine because it's thick fabric, double layered. So if your fabric is thick and you're struggling with all those layers of fabric, I'm going to show you a different way of doing it. And that is, instead of doing your bar tack on the top of your belt loop, you sew it on just 1 layer of belt loop inside, like on that fold. So you can see here that I folded up my belt loop and I'm doing my bar tack on the inside, on that edge. Then I'm going to fold it to the upper position. I'm going to pin it on the underside and then just kind of fold it away so I can get my presser foot in there and do my bar tack stitch on that edge as well. And this is what it looks like. So there's no visible bar tacks on the outside. And this is what it looks like with the belt inside. I think that's a really clean finish. So choose whichever way is best for you and your fabric, what you're comfortable with, what look you prefer. Now we're almost done. I'm going to put my lining jacket into my main fabric jacket, wrong sides facing each other. I'm going to pin that along all of the edges, matching up my seams. So matching up my raglan seams, matching up my sleeve seams on the sleeve end, matching up my sideline seams. When all of the edges are pinned together, I'm going to overlock all of the edges or zigzag, whatever. This is to keep my 2 layers of fabric from moving when I do my bias binding on the edges. So here I have all my edges overlocked. This is what it looks like. It looks really nice and neat. And for me, the final step now is to add the bias binding. Of course, if you're doing buttons, you have 1 more step after the binding. But for me, this is the final step. So to get a nice start and finish to my bias binding, I'll start at a side seam or the underseam of my sleeve. Like I will not start my binding on the outer seam of my sleeve. So I'm going to start with my sleeves to just explain how to do it. So the first thing I will do is fold open my binding. Then I'll fold in the end of my binding, created a folded edge. This folded edge I will align with a seam on the underside of my sleeve. Then I will pin the binding to the inside of my sleeve, edge to edge. And when I get to that folded edge that I started with, I will overlap my binding a little bit over that edge and then just cut it off. So this is what the connection looks like. I'll do that exact same thing all over the other edges of my jacket. And on the body pieces, I will align that folded end of the binding with my side seam. Now when the bias is pinned in place on all of my edges, I will stitch it in place in the first fold nearest to the edge of the jacket. When that seam is done, I will take all of my pins out and I'll fold my bias over the edge of the jacket, enclosing that overlocked or zigzagged edge into my binding. I'll also fold in the raw edge of my bias. When you fold your binding over the edge of the jacket, you also want to make sure that it covers that stitch that you just sewed. Pin your binding in place all around. Then top stitch your binding on the outside of the jacket, like 2 millimeters from the edge, so that it just covers that previous seam. And that should then mean that you're also sewing on the binding on the inside of your jacket. You could of course also sew this with a binding foot if you have one. Slow and steady wins the race. And if you struggle with this, like don't get discouraged. It takes practice, it takes time to get a nice binding edge. Do a couple of practice pieces before you attack the binding on your jacket if you're struggling with it. And this is what it should look like when it's done. A really neatly sewn binding on both outside and inside. And then go ahead and do the same thing on all of the edges of your jacket. If you're sewing your jacket without buttons like me, then you are done after this step. But if you are adding buttons, then follow the instructions in the pattern file. So you have markings on the pattern pieces to where your buttons go. The markings are based on buttons that measure 2 centimeters in diameter, but you can use smaller or larger buttons if you want. Just adjust the markings on your pieces to fit the diameter of your buttons. When I sew buttons, I usually sew the buttons on the left side and the buttonholes on the right side, but again, that is up to you. You choose whatever you want. And I suggest doing horizontal buttonholes on the center and vertical buttonholes on the pockets. This is to allow for the most amount of ease. And again, if you want a little bit more explanation to why the direction, vertical or horizontal, matters for your buttonhole, you can check my vlog for this jacket where I explain the buttonhole direction a little bit more in detail. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like my content, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. That really helps me out. And you can follow me on Instagram at Studio Carolina Shearer. And remember, if you do post a picture of your jacket, please tag me and use the hashtag #CSAllWeatherJacket so I can see it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.